Hi everyone, Lior is here with another Jumpstart Lightning episode. We are continuing our nuts and bolts video series, and today we're going to talk about how do we actually test Azure Arc-enabled servers with Azure VMs. Stay tuned. Hi everyone, Lior is here with another Jumpstart Lightning episode, and today we are continuing our nuts and bolts video series. I have Aurnov with me. Aurnov, how are you doing, sir?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I was excited to have you in the Nuts and Bolts video series because you and I have been working together for a while, and you have some cool things to show me today. But first thing first, tell the audience who you are and what is it that you do.
Hey folks, I'm Aurnov. I'm a PM working on Azure Arc on the server side.
So, Aurnov, you and I have been working together on multiple things, but one of the things that you and I are experiencing a lot is when customers are asking us, how can I actually go by and test Azure Arc-enabled servers with the only thing that I have is an Azure environment? How do I do that? So today we're here to talk about that.
Right on. And it's an ask we get really often because not everyone has, an on-prem Windows server or a AWS EC2 instance that they can Arc-enable to see all of the capabilities that we have for Arc-enabled servers. So we do offer a way to basically pre-configure an existing Azure VM. And so you can evaluate a lot of the Arc-enabled server capabilities with that.
And, Aurnov, you may know this, but as part of the Jumpstart, in some of the scenarios and also in our box, we're actually leveraging this technique in order for us to provide a way to simulate the full-blown Azure Arc-enabled servers environment on top of Azure virtual machines. So that's super relevant to us as well. So I think that this is a good segue. Let's just, get going, show me the magic, and how can we do this?
Awesome. Let's get started. So diving right in, we see here a virtual machine in Azure that we've pre-configured. And so this is a Windows Server 2019 data center, a vanilla Azure VM. And it's sitting here within our nuts and bolts resource group just for today. And so we're going to go right in and we're going to actually start off by doing a handful of steps with this Azure VM to make sure it's ready for onboarding into Arc-enabled servers. And we're going to do that just as we would Arc-enable other resources generating a script from Azure Portal. So let's get after it with this specific Azure VM. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to check extensions. And so, you might have Azure policies, some sort of automation that's generating extensions for your Azure VMs. You want to make sure that there are no extensions currently enabled for your Azure VM. And so the reason you want to do that is because the connected machine agent actually has its own extension manager component. So you can deploy VM extensions at ease with your Arc-enabled servers. You don't want to have interference where you have both these existing VM extensions that are traced with your Azure VM, and then you try to deploy extensions with your Arc-enabled server. So you want to clean that up for the extension manager. And so here we're in a clean situation, but if you had extensions, you'd want to make sure there are none.
So, again, this is an Azure VM and we want to keep things clean. So I think that for the audience, what they need to understand here really is that think of this as a server that is installed under your desk, right? It's not an Azure VM, obviously, and there is no notions of extensions to this server yet before it's Arc-enabled. So I think that's kind of the comparison that I always do in my head when I'm explaining people about the notion of using Azure VMs as a test case for Azure Arc-enabled servers. Okay, what's next?
Right on. So next, we're going to actually be disabling the other components of the connected machine. And so specifically, the connected machine agent has a guest configuration component, and it also has a hybrid instance metadata service. And so Azure VM has similar analogous parts as well. And so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be shutting down the guest configuration service for this Azure VM, and we're also going to be blocking the Azure IMDS endpoint. And so for that, we have our handy documentation that actually walks through the specific commands you need to run on this Azure VM.
So, Aurnov, in the previous episode for Nuts and Bolts, I had a conversation with Ryan Willis about how to think about the metadata service. That's what we talked about. And now you're bringing an interesting point that we actually need to manipulate, or we need to trick the metadata service in order for this thing to work. And I'm also happy to see that this is documented very well. So that's cool.
Yeah, right on. So the first thing we're going to be doing is disabling the Azure VM guest agent. And so we're just going to be copying these commands to basically stop the Azure guest agent component so it doesn't interfere with the guest configuration component of the Azure connected machine agent when we onboard. So just copy those in. And I've opened in this RDP for the nuts and bolts VM. One thing we're going to note is we're going to actually be doing some PowerShell commands. And so we're going to be opening up PowerShell ISE, but we're going to be running as administrator. You're going to see it's going to be important to run as administrator down the road as well, or when we're going to be doing the actual onboarding to Arc. So here, I'm going to go ahead, paste the commands. Perfect, copy paste work. Sometimes that's the toughest part of this evaluation.
So what we're doing right now is we are disabling the guest config, or the guest agent, sorry, that is installed automatically on any Azure VM that you're deploying. So that's the first step. Okay.
Yep, right on. So that's the second thing we need to do for our prereqs. And the third thing is we're going to be blocking that Azure IMDS endpoint, just like we were talking about, so it doesn't interfere with the HIMDS, the Hybrid Instance Metadata Service. So I just copied that command. And you can see it's just a new firewall rule where we're going to be blocking that endpoint. And so I'm going to be going ahead, back to RDP. Awesome, 2 for 2. So we just pasted it right there and enter. Great. So those are all the steps it takes to actually pre-configure our Azure VM. So now it's basically ready for enablement, just like you would do with an on-prem Windows server or EC2 instance, something in GCP even. So
this Azure VM is no longer an Azure VM, basically.
Yeah, we've basically tricked the Azure control plane into thinking it's no longer in Azure for the purposes of Arc enablement.
That's a cool hack.
Yep, right on. So we're going to go right in, and we're just going to go to Azure Arc and servers. We're going to go ahead and add. And because we have a single server here, we're going to be using the single server onboarding. So we're going to be generating a script there. And so we have the access to Azure services. We ran as admin, so we have that local admin permission. And for connectivity method, there's private link and proxy support for Arc server, but we want to keep things simple. So we're just going to be using a public endpoint for today. And we have that handy nuts and bolts resource group as well, where we're going to be landing the projection through Arc. So in terms of basic resource details right here, we're going to be putting this in the Arc-enabled services demo. And we're going to be picking the nuts and bolts resource group. Awesome. And East-US Windows public endpoint. Perfect. So those are some of the basic details. Here we can add tags. For example, we can maybe add a nuts and bolts tag. Bolts and true. Next. And here we have it. We have our script. And so we're going to be running the script in PowerShell within that Azure VM.
And Aurnov, because this is a single server automation that we just generated via the Azure Arc Center, it will also require us to log in, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this is going to be the single server method, and so that's going to require us to do a device login. If you do the service principal for its scale onboarding, then you don't have to do the interactive login. But because we're just working with one server, figured this would make sense for now.
Okay.
Awesome. So we have our script. We're going to go ahead and paste that so you can see it in all of its magic. And we have here, we're going to be downloading the installation package from the Microsoft Download Center. Then we're going to be installing the hybrid agent, connecting to Azure. And once we've successfully onboarded, we'll be getting a notification so we can go to Azure and test it out. And here you see with the connect command, we're actually feeding in resource group details, for example, the subscription, the location, tagging, etc., that we were generating in Azure Portal. Awesome. So I'll go ahead and do the onboarding. So then we can run the script.
So Aurnov, while this is onboarding, I wanted to ask you, what are the conversations that you have when people wants to do this type of stuff, and when would you say, "Hey, use this instead of using that"? Like how how do you go by and explain this to people?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. Typically, we see this sort of simulation as really serving kind of testing and evaluating some Arc-enabled server capabilities.
Mhm.
So with the projection, we have a subset of the Azure VM capabilities and management services afforded through Azure. And so when you want to try testing that out, and you don't necessarily have on-prem or multi-cloud instances that you can Arc-enable, then this
Mhm.
would make sense as a sort of easy way to kind of get started, see what's available, see the kind of iconography and everything around that for your Arc-enabled servers.
Gotcha. So I see that now that it's actually asking you to log in,
Yep.
and this is because of the single server, right?
Yeah, right on. And so if we were going to use like a service principal or we were using another onboarding method, we wouldn't have that. But in this case, we're going to be doing a device login real quick. And so it's going to ask for that code that I just copied, entering
Mhm.
that in, signing in. Yep, it's me. And indeed I am. Try to connect. And we're in. So we can go back to RDP view. It's going to take just a second
Mhm.
to load.
So this is a super straightforward process. I mean, if you want to go and start using Azure VMs as your test bed for Azure Arc-enabled servers, like this is a very painless uh, process, and I can already see that we're successfully onboarded. So
Yeah,
that didn't take a lot of time. It took like less than 3 minutes, I want to say, with
yeah,
explanations. So that's pretty awesome.
yeah. It's really easy process to start evaluating, and so we can actually jump right into Azure Portal. And
Hmm.
so we saw the onboarding happen. And so with Azure Arc, we're going to be looking specifically within that subscription, the Arc-enabled services subscription in this case. And here we see the nuts and bolts
Cool.
free VM showing up as an Arc-enabled server resource this time instead of an Azure VM. And we're going to be able to test out VM extensions with it, tag it, see all of the pieces of the Azure management plane that you can use with an Arc-enabled server.
That's super awesome, and I'm happy that that we had a chance to show this because, again, this is one of those things that
Mhm.
people don't even think about. How do I actually go by and test Azure Arc-enabled servers when you're asking me to have resources that are or servers that are deployed outside of Azure? So that's really awesome. And for the audience, for the Jumpstart Lightning audience, thank you so much for joining to this episode of Jumpstart Lightning. In order for us to bring people like Aurnov to the show, help support the channel. Like this video, subscribe to the channel so we can bring more awesome content to you and to make sure that you will get notified in our future releases as part of this video series and as part of Jumpstart Lightning. Aurnov, I want to say thank you so much for joining me for this Jumpstart Lightning episode.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.